It's time for the conservative movement to stop its obsession and idolization and emulation of Ronald Reagan. There, I said it. I know I already have a lot of angry boomers in the comments, but seriously, hear me out now. Now, I know Red Eagle already made a video like this for APU, but trust me, the talking points in this video, there will be some overlap, but there's also going to be a lot of differences. So, trust me, you're not watching the same video twice. But this is a video I've been wanting to make ever since a few weeks ago when Paul Ryan, absolute loser that he is, gave this whole horrendous speech at the Reagan Library about how Trumpism is toxic and divisive and we need to return to Reaganism. And this video is a message to the Paul Ryans of the world, to the Young America's Foundations of this world, who basically is like a conservative student organization who tries to breed and create young conservatives, which is obviously good, but is trying to create a bunch of young Reaganites here in the 21st century. Here they are basically trying to recreate the Reagan Revolution in the 21st century. I am here to say that is not going to work, that is severely outdated, and I'm even further here to say that even back when it happened and back when it was prominent, it was pretty overrated for these specific reasons. Now, before I get into it, let me give Reagan credit where it's due. By historical standards, again, not by modern conservative standards, right? I don't believe that Ronald Reagan is the model conservative and the person that conservatives should be trying to emulate their approach off of here in the 21st century. But by historical standards, Ronald Reagan was a fairly solid president, most notably because of his accomplishments with the Cold War, which I cannot deny. Ronald Reagan largely can be credited with accelerating and ensuring the downfall of the Soviet Union and hence winning the Cold War for the United States. I would never deny that. And if, assuming the history books are not written by leftists, this is something that he should be given credit with in history. The problem is that is in a historical context. Conservatives cannot really apply that accomplishment, that crowning feature of Ronald Reagan, and take it here into the 21st century. Why? Because he ended the Cold War. The Cold War has been over for decades now. And so what relevance does that approach, do those stances of Ronald Reagan actually have today? But Vince, what about China? Don't we have a Cold War with China? In ways, yes, we do. Here's the difference. The Cold War that we are currently fighting with China is more of an economic war than a military war. You see, the battle with the Soviet Union had a lot to do with proxy wars, correct? And the way that Ronald Reagan actually burst the Soviet bubble was spending a bunch on defense. He knew the Soviets couldn't keep up with it, so he put a bunch of money into defense spending. It freaked out the Soviets, and essentially the Soviet bubble burst. The issue is, that is not the battle that we are fighting with China today. We already vastly outspend China on defense. China doesn't care because China knows, and we implicitly know as well, that the real battle is an economic one. It has to do with trade and investments and buying influence in different countries around the world, right? Not necessarily invading countries around the world, but buying out their influence, right? So that is the battle we face today. So even on the Cold War front, even the one thing you could give Reagan credit for, it is not politically relevant to the conservative movement in the 21st century. So we can't mention the Cold War. When we assess Ronald Reagan and we ask ourselves as conservatives, is this really our guy? Is this the guy that we should be emulating and following and trying to recreate? We have to look at Reagan's policy record outside of the Cold War. And who was Ronald Reagan really outside of that? Well, if you are a supporter of the 2016 Trump revolution, if you're a supporter of President Trump, if you are a follower of MAGA, of America First, I am here to say that really Ronald Reagan should not be a guy that you particularly are a huge fan of. Why? What were Trump's two biggest issues that you basically became a supporter of him because and are very serious to you? Trade and immigration, okay? That's ultimately the reason why Donald Trump won the 2016 election. Ronald Reagan was a supporter of mass amnesty and free trade. And these were not exactly small stances of his, okay? In 1986, through the Immigration Control Act, quote unquote, Ronald Reagan granted amnesty to 3 million illegal immigrants, okay? And this can largely be credited to about 75% of the reason why California became such a blue state at such a fast rate, basically starting in the 1990s, okay? Ask yourself this question again. what would you say if if a Republican tomorrow gave amnesty to 3 million illegal immigrants? Would you tout that guy as like, your hero? Yeah, I'm going to emulate that guy. I want to follow that guy. I want to spread that guy's ideas. Or would you call him a loser, establishment, rhino, neocon? I would guess the latter, which is exactly what I'm saying. So why does that not apply to you with Ronald Reagan? Again, if you're looking at him through a historical context, you can excuse it to be, well, different for the time, whatever. Okay, I don't really care, honestly. But for the conservatives who are still trying to emulate this guy's model in the 21st century, how can you ignore stuff like this? What was the other issue? Well, it was trade, right? Trump was big on trade. Trump was big on repealing NAFTA. If you were a supporter of Trump in the 2020 election, one of your biggest talking points supporting Trump probably was the USMCA, the fact that Trump revised NAFTA. Well, it's really no secret that Ronald Reagan was a supporter of globalism, okay? It was super pro-free trade, and this was not simply in rhetoric, by the way. Ronald Reagan set the groundwork and actually started the negotiations for NAFTA. Obviously, Bill Clinton is the person who signed NAFTA, but it was Reagan and Bush who got NAFTA basically rolling in the works, and basically all Clinton had to do by that time he was president was sign it. And it was not just Reagan, by the way, that was pro-free trade. Let's also remember that Bush 1 and Bush 2, and basically the entire Republican Party, all the way up until Donald Trump himself, was pro-free trade. Reagan, and we always talk about trade and what is done to middle America and what is done to the Midwest and all of our disastrous trade policies. And I agree, you guys know I agree, which is exactly why I cannot hold a supposedly amazing Republican president, conservative hero, this is our guy right here, in very high regard when he's literally saying stuff like this about the issue of trade, and when he is hugely the reason why the Republican Party over the past few decades has been hollowing out and selling out our country to foreign nations. And really, on these issues alone, I really have to say, well, I can't honestly say that I think Ronald Reagan, by conservative standards, right? Not by historical standards, but by modern conservative standards, really is all that great of a guy, and someone, not great of a president, that is, and someone I should really be trying to follow or emulate. Now, I know what people are going to say. Well, Vince, you're ignoring Reagan's other achievement, which is the economy, right? He created a record number of jobs. He basically revitalized the American economy after a stagnant 1970s. And again, this is something I don't deny. This is absolutely true. Here's the issue. Reaganomics, okay, is this something conservatives really should be trying to emulate in the modern day? This is something that the Republican Party largely does still subscribe to. That's probably the most lasting impact of Ronald Reagan's legacy, is his economics basically still influence most of the Republican Party today. Now, don't get me wrong. I am a supporter of deregulation. I think we all are. We all support, mostly for the most part, deregulation and lower taxes, and we believe those things are good for economic growth. But that's not to say that I don't think Reaganomics has its severe shortcomings. When you look to the state of the modern economy in the 21st century, I think we would all agree, even if it's just on the issue of big tech, fine, we can at least meet there, that a higher degree of government regulation over corporations is needed, okay? We need trust busting. We need actually basically government to come in and do something about corporate tyranny. We need that, right? So I would argue that something more aligned to the economics of 2016 Trumpism, or even Josh Hawley today. Josh Hawley's actually pretty solid, I think, on economics. This is the model that we ought to be following as conservatives. And Reaganomics, these things are against Reaganomics, by the way. Trump, trust busting, regulating corporate tyranny, trying to defend small business against corporate overreach and monopolization of market share. These are not aspects of Reaganomics, right? These technically go against the traditional small government view of conservatism, which largely, by the way, has basically stopped conservatives from actually doing anything about any of these issues. Now, again, let me reiterate that if you're a supporter of 2016, if you're a supporter of that whole revolution, basically, are you starting to see, when you really break it down on trade, on immigration, on foreign policy, you could argue to some degree, and, on the issue of economics, on most issues, on most of, relevant issues, Trumpism unlike a lot of the conservative establishment and the way they try to frame it, Trumpism is not simply a continuation or just a rebranding of Reaganism. No, Trumpism is and always will be actually a rebellion against Reaganism and a rebellion against the Republican Party that Ronald Reagan left behind. And so, to me, you really cannot be a big fan of one or the other, okay? Again, you can give Reagan credit for his historical accomplishments or whatever, but ultimately, for the person that you're emulating, you really, in my opinion, have to choose one or the other. Even take the issue of the Second Amendment. Now, there's an issue that's basically timeless with conservatives. It doesn't matter if you're Tea Party, Reaganite, even like a neocon, Trump, whatever. Like, we all are big fans of the Second Amendment. That's the one thing we all can unite on. And don't get me wrong, Trump was not perfect on it. I'm not saying he was. But Reagan was terrible on the issue of the Second Amendment. Obviously, most famously, you have the Hughes Amendment. He banned machine guns while he was president. But it does not stop there. I mean, Reagan, while he was governor of California, basically restricted concealed carry. And after he was president, was there in front of Congress lobbying, or I shouldn't say lobbying, but speaking out in support of the 1994 assault weapons ban. Again, let me ask you the question. If a Republican was doing all of this today, would you call them the great hero of your movement, or would you call him a freaking rhino establishment neo? Exactly. Okay. Now let me address the main counter-argument that I think most people are going to say in response to this, which goes something along the lines of, well, Vince, you better show some respect, boy. Don't you know Reagan won like 40 out of 50 states in 1980 and then ended up winning it's like the biggest landslide ever in 1984. Sure, that's all true. But again, remember, stop your 80s nostalgia for a second, okay? We all love the 80s. I wasn't even alive, but I like the 80s. But let's stop that nostalgia for a second and recognize that if Ronald Reagan ran for president today, he very likely, not only just definitely would not get anywhere close to even like 40 states, he very likely would not even get to 270 today, okay? And part of the big reason we know this and can observe this is because of, who else but Mitt Romney? Are we forgetting the fact that Mitt Romney essentially tried to emulate and copy Reagan in 2012 in mannerism? He looked like Reagan. He brought a lot of Reaganite ideas to the table. And guess what happened? Obama crushed him, okay? And let me explain why that is. The reason why Reaganism is not an effective political strategy today is because the type of conservatism that Ronald Reagan basically tried to run off of is not actually like real traditional conservatism in the sense of like actual like old conservatism. It was a kind of coalition-based ideology known as fusionism, okay? So fusionism essentially was the fusion of like social and cultural conservatives with political and economic libertarianism. Best and most simply understood, it is that small government conservatism, right? It is that conservatarianism that, Reagan popularized, but it didn't start with Reagan. The origins of it go all the way back to William F. Buckley, who was the founder of the National Review, and the approach, the conservatarian approach, the fusionist coalition is something that was basically created with Barry Goldwater in 1964, and Reagan basically took it from him. Okay, so that is the type of conservatism that we're actually dealing with. Now, I've gone over many times why fusionism, why conservatarianism, number one, is just not real conservatism, and number two, that libertarian approach to politics, it will be that small government. Oh, well, we can't save the country. That would be big government. Vince, isn't that big government, right? That type of approach literally will, be the political suicide of the conservative movement. Because we look to the issues today, we can so clearly see that if we do not use the government, like the only basically institution we have left that can do anything to do something, our country will be lost, okay? But even further, the real issue, okay, with fusionism is that it's actually not appealing. Like it's actually not appealing, at least anymore. Now, let's talk about anymore and ask if it was really even appealing back when Reagan won. Okay, but first, anymore. Okay, I mean, it's very, just look at Trump. Trump proved that fusionism is no longer appealing, okay? And yes, we did have the Tea Party. The Tea Party was heavily based on fusionism. But did the Tea Party ever really win significant political office besides like Ted Cruz and Rand Paul? Did the Tea Party last? No, the Tea Party was literally knocked out and replaced with Trumpism, and it was Trumpism that actually managed to really fully take over the Republican Party, okay? And really, the fact that even among the Republican base, Trump took out basically what was a stage of like mostly a bunch of fusionists, bunch of conservatarians, right? Took out Ted Cruz, took out Rand Paul, took out all these people, right? The fact that Trump did that basically proves that even with the Republican electorate, fusionism grows increasingly unpopular. And we can look to the electoral map today. We can look at the fact that in the modern day, we need to win working class, blue collar states like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, like Wisconsin, right? Even like Ohio. And we know that the fusionist approach traditionally was not something that was very popular with the white working class, with rural areas in general, right? And we know that this is something that ultimately is just not that appealing to these types of groups of people. But I know what you're going to say. But Vince, okay, fine. Maybe fusionism is kind of not effective today and not really appealing today. And again, if you want to say that, we need to create a new type of fusionism, arguably social conservatism fused with economic nationalism, economic populism, yeah, I'm a fan of that, right? But, okay, let me get back to what I was saying. So, I know what you might say. Well, Vince, okay, you're being an asshole though right now, because you ought to give Ronald Reagan more credit, boy. Isn't it true that Ronald Reagan basically can be credited with entirely reviving the corpse of conservatism in America? See, this is true. Okay, this is true. Ronald Reagan essentially did revive conservatism. The Reagan Revolution essentially took conservatism, which was like an irrelevant political movement at the time, and basically brought it back into the mainstream, brought it back into prominence. And obviously, Ronald Reagan deserves credit for this. Here's my problem. I would argue that fusionism actually was not really the reason that the Reagan Revolution happened, nor was his stances on trade, because people will say, well, maybe it was needed back then. Maybe free trade was needed back then. Maybe amnesty was needed back then. I disagree strongly with all of that. Because I would argue the real reason that the Reagan Revolution happened didn't really even have anything to do with like small government, big government. I mean, don't get me wrong. There was some extent of like, it's kind of discontent with so much government spending in the 60s and 70s. But let's be honest, and if you were alive back then, you might even kind of really be able to attest to this. The real reason the Reagan Revolution happened didn't really have that much to do with any of these specific like policy positions. What is the real reason the Reagan Revolution happened? Number one was simply because of Reagan's like charismatic, enigmatic personality. Like that's number one. That's the reason why it happened. And symbolically, right? Not only was Ronald Reagan like very charismatic and very kind of like a good speaker, a good uniter as a leader, but Ronald Reagan essentially symbolized American resurgence, right? His slogan, after all, was "Let's make America great again." After you had basically the 1970s, which were a decade of embarrassment for America. Obviously, you have the Vietnam War, Watergate, Jimmy Carter, the gas crisis, economic stagnation, Iranian hostage crisis, the fact that it even seemed like to an extent America was kind of losing the Cold War, right? It was that sentiment. It was that sort of, we want America to be back, America to be strong again, that resurgence, that kind of generic type of sentiment that, by the way, Trump also, capitalized off of in his own ways, right? I would argue that is the real reason why Reagan won and was so popular. So, like, it had nothing to do with trade or really that much to do with fusionism, right? It was more that Reagan was the symbol of America, like the American comeback, right? And so the reason I bring that up is because with that being said, Reagan could have essentially pitched whatever type of conservatism that he wanted, so long as he had that kind of Cold Warrior mentality, right? Because let's not forget, there were a lot of neocons obviously surrounding Reagan, but let's not forget, you know who else worked for Reagan? You know who else was a supporter of Reagan at the time? Pat Buchanan, right? The basically the OG paleoconservative. And the paleoconservatives back then and neoconservatives both sort of united on that Cold Warrior American resurgence mentality. So that's not even what they disagreed on, right? And so I would argue that so long as Reagan had that sort of, American comeback message, he also simultaneously could have like that was what brought people to Reagan. That's what brought people to conservatism. And so Reagan could have used that platform, sort of that popularity, to push something much more akin to the ideology of Pat Buchanan and of paleo-conservatives than, what he ended up doing, that fusionism, that Goldwaterism that he ended up doing. And he could have set the precedent for that. He could have set the tone for that being the conservative movement, basically the entire next few decades. And imagine how much better it would have been. Imagine if Reagan largely, had a lot of kind of Trumpist sentiments on issues. Literally, just imagine, like, our country would be in such a better place right now. And we all know it to be true. And I would argue it's not like Reagan had to be a fusionist. He literally did not have to, okay? He would have won regardless. I mean, honestly, he would have won regardless. Let's be honest. I mean, Jimmy Carter was deeply unpopular. You basically could have run anyone for the Republicans and won in that 1980 election. But even that aside, I think Reagan was bound, just by his personality and just by his spirit and what he symbolically represented, he was bound to give birth to a political movement anyway. The problem is, and the reason why I kind of actually see it as a negative, is that he gave birth to the wrong type of conservatism. He set the tone for bad conservatism, for poor conservatism over the next few decades, and that is ultimately why I say that Ronald Reagan, as a model conservative, as a conservative icon, all this is vastly overrated. And it is now time, in 2021, now that we can clearly see the flaws of all of basically the coalition that he tried to build, now it is time to let Reagan stay in the past, to leave Reaganism in the past, okay? That's all I'm saying, ultimately. It is time to basically embrace Trumpism, and when I say Trumpism, I mean the OG 2016 spirit, and build upon that and expand upon that. I believe there are expansions that need to be made, but ultimately, that should be our starting place. That should be our model, okay? And if you truly believe and understand, the Trump revolution of 2016, then when I compare Trump's record to Reagan's record, I think it becomes pretty obvious. I think you should be able to see why it's time to hang up the boots on Reagan, okay? Sorry, Yaf. Sorry, Paul Ryan. But it's time to let, that thinking go. And let's be honest, folks. If Ronald Reagan were alive today, and it's very hard, again, to really tell what someone would think, but I would bet my money, actually, that if Ronald Reagan were alive today, he would not have been a huge fan of Trump. And I don't just say this because his literal son, said so. I say this because I can tell, like, all the people that descended from Reagan, right? The type of Reaganites that descended from him, they all hate Trump. Right? And the reason they hate Trump is because the type of conservatism that Trump, again, stands for, and obviously, there's just rhetoric and all that stuff too, and I'm sure Reagan would have hated that because he came from the civility times, right? But even beyond that, on issues, okay, on solid issues, Trump railed against everything that, not everything, but a huge majority of the things that Reagan was kind of iconic for supporting. So, let's consider that. Again, if you want to stick with Reagan, I know there's some YAF kids that still are Reagan LARPers, okay, but I went over it too, You can try fusionism again. I don't want you to, but maybe you'll get in the position where you're able to. Try it again. It's not going to work out well for you. You're not even going to get to 270, okay? And fundamentally, that type of philosophy is flawed anyway because it literally hinders conservatives from ever being able to do anything effective when they have power, and hence, that is a huge reason why even when we hold power, even when we hold all three chambers of government, it still feels like the left is winning because of that fusionist mentality that stops us from actually being effective. So anyways, guys, I'll see you guys later. Thank you very much for watching. Again, time to leave Reaganism in the past. Peace. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to click some of the stuff on my left for some more awesome content. Also, to follow me on social media, check out my podcast, and some more awesome stuff, be sure to check out the links down in my description. All right? Peace.